In 45 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero published the book entitled On the Ends of Good and Evil. Cicero wrote in that book that Lucius Manlius Torquatus, senator and praetor of the Roman Republic, had delivered the following defense of the philosophy of Epicurus. According to Cicero, Torquatus spoke as follows: I will start in the manner approved by Epicurus himself, the author of the system, by examining the essence and quality of the thing that is the object of our inquiry. This is not because I suppose that you are ignorant of it, but because this is the logical method of procedure. We are inquiring then into what is the final and ultimate good, which all philosophers are agreed must be of such a nature as to be the end to which all other things are means, while it is not itself a means to anything else. This Epicurus finds in pleasure. Pleasure he holds to be the chief good, and pain he holds to be the chief evil. He sets out to prove this as follows. Every animal, as soon as it is born, seeks for pleasure, and delights in pleasure as the chief good, while it recoils from pain as the chief evil, and so far as possible avoids pain. This it does as long as it remains unperverted, at the prompting of nature's own unbiased and honest verdict. Based on this evidence, Epicurus refuses to admit any necessity for argument to prove that pleasure is desirable and pain is to be avoided. These facts, he thinks, are perceived by the senses in the same way we perceive that fire is hot, snow is white, and honey is sweet. None of these things need be proved by elaborate argument. It is enough merely to draw attention to them. For there is a difference, Epicurus holds, between formal logical proof of a thing and a mere notice or reminder. Formal logical proof is the method for discovering difficult and hidden truths. Notice and reminder is the method for indicating matters that are obvious and evident. Consider that if you strip mankind of sensation, nothing remains. It follows then that nature herself is the judge of that which is in accordance with or contrary to nature. What does nature perceive, or what does she judge of, besides pleasure and pain, to guide her actions of desire and of avoidance? Some members of our school, however, would refine upon this doctrine. These men say that it is not enough for the judgment of good and evil to rest with the senses. To them, the fact that pleasure is in and for itself desirable, and pain in and for itself to be avoided, can also be grasped by the intellect and reason. Accordingly, these men declare that the perception that pleasure is to be sought after and pain avoided is a notion naturally implanted in our mind. Other men, with whom I agree, observe that a great many philosophers advance a vast array of reasons to allegedly prove why pleasure should not be counted as a good, nor pain as an evil. These men consider that we had better not be too confident of our case, as in their view proof of the argument requires elaborate and reasoned discussion about the nature of pleasure and pain. But I must now explain to you how the mistaken idea of condemning pleasure and extolling pain has arisen. To do so, I will give you a complete account of the system of Epicurus, and I will expound the actual teachings of the great explorer of truth, the master builder of human happiness. No one rejects, dislikes, or avoids pleasure simply because it is pleasure, but because those who do not know how to pursue pleasure rationally often encounter consequences that are extremely painful. Nor again is there anyone who loves or pursues or desires pain in and for itself, but because in some circumstances toil and pain can in fact produce great pleasure. To take a trivial example, who among us ever undertakes laborious physical exercise except to obtain advantage from it? But who has any right to find fault with a man who chooses to enjoy a pleasure that has no annoying consequences, or find fault with a man who avoids a pain that produces no resulting pleasure. On the other hand, we denounce with righteous indignation those men who are so beguiled and demoralized by the charms of the pleasures of the moment, and are so blinded by desire that they cannot foresee the pain and trouble that are bound to follow. Equal blame belongs to those who fail in their duty through weakness of will, which is the same as saying that they shrink back from toil and pain. These cases are perfectly simple and easy to distinguish. In a free hour, when our power of choice is unrestrained, and when nothing prevents our being able to do what we like best, every pleasure is to be welcomed, and every pain is to be avoided. But in certain emergencies, or owing to the claims of duty or the obligations of business, it will often occur that some pleasures will have to be rejected, and some pains accepted. The wise man, therefore, always holds in these matters to this principle of selection. He rejects lesser pleasures to secure other pleasures which are greater, and he endures lesser pains to avoid other pains which are worse. This being the theory I hold, why should I be afraid of not being able to reconcile it with the examples set by my ancestors? Your references to them previously were historically correct, and also showed your kind and friendly feeling towards myself. But all the same, I will not be bribed by your flattery of my family, and your words will not make me a less resolute opponent. Tell me, what explanation do you yourself put upon their actions? Do you really believe that they charged an armed enemy, or treated their children, their own flesh and blood, with such harshness, without a thought for their own interest or advantage? Why, even wild animals do not act in that way, and they do not run amok so blindly that we cannot discern some purpose in their actions. Can you then suppose that my heroic ancestors performed their famous deeds without any motive at all? What their motive actually was, I will consider in a moment. For now, I will confidently assert that if they had a motive for those undoubtedly glorious exploits, that motive was not a love of virtue in and for itself. One ancestor wrested the necklet from his foe. Yes, and by this he saved himself from death. But you say that he braved great danger to do so? Yes, and he did so before the eyes of the army. What did my ancestor gain by braving this danger? He received honor and esteem, the strongest guarantees of security in life. At another time, my ancestor sentenced his own son to death for violating the rules of battle. If he did so with no motive, I would be sorry to be the descendant of anyone so savage and inhumane. But in this case, my ancestor's purpose was to establish his authority as a commander, even at cost of inflicting pain upon himself, and thereby to tighten the reins of discipline during a very serious war, by holding over his army the fear of punishment. We can see by this that his action aimed at ensuring the safety of his fellow citizens, upon which he knew his own safety depended. What I have just described is a principle of wide application. People of your school, Cicero, and especially you yourself, are diligent students of history. You have found a favorite field for the display of your eloquence in recalling the stories of brave and famous men, and in praising their actions. These you praise not for their practical accomplishments, but on account of the alleged splendor of abstract moral worth. But all of your arguments against me fall to the ground if the principle of action that I have just explained be understood. That some pleasures are to be passed over in order to gain greater pleasures, and that some pains are to be endured for the sake of avoiding greater pains. But enough has been said about the glorious exploits of famous heroes of the past. The tendency of the virtues to produce pleasure is a topic that I will treat later on. At present, I will proceed to explain the essence and the qualities of the term pleasure itself. In doing so, I will work to remove the misconceptions of ignorance, and to make you realize how serious and how temperate is the school that is mistakenly supposed to be sensual, lax, and luxurious. The pleasure we Epicureans pursue includes those experiences in which our physical being is directly affected by a delightful stimulation of the senses. But not those experiences alone. In addition, as held by Epicurus, pleasure is understood to include the absence of pain. Given that this is so, the most complete pleasure is experienced as a result of the total and complete removal of all pain. When we are released from pain, the mere sensation of relief from pain is in itself a source of pleasure. But everything that causes relief is a pleasure, just as everything that causes annoyance is a pain. Therefore, absence of pain has correctly been identified as pleasure. For example, when hunger and thirst are banished by food and drink, the mere fact of getting rid of uneasiness brings pleasure as a result. In such a case, the removal of pain causes pleasure to take its place. As a result, Epicurus maintains that there is no such thing as a neutral state of feeling in the middle between pleasure and pain. That is because the absence of pain, the state supposed by some thinkers to be neutral, is itself among those experiences which we call pleasure. Further, Epicurus held that the complete removal of all pain is the limit of pleasure. This is because a man who is at all conscious of his condition must necessarily feel either pleasures or pains. Epicurus thinks that the limit of the experience of pleasures is when pains are completely and totally removed. After that, pleasures may vary, and we may experience differences among pleasures, but once all pain has been removed, we are incapable of experiencing additional pleasures, and our condition cannot be further improved. When my father in Athens wanted to air his wit at the expense of the Stoics, he used to tell me that there is in the Ceramicus a statue of Chrysippus seated and holding forward one of his hands. This gesture was intended to indicate the delight which Chrysippus used to take in the following little syllogism, which goes like this: "Does your hand want anything while it is in its present condition? No, nothing. But if pleasure were good, it would want pleasure. Yes, I suppose it would. Therefore, pleasure is not the good." This is an argument, my father declared, which not even a statue would employ if a statue could speak. That is because, though the argument is cogent enough as an objection to the Cyrenaics, it does not touch Epicurus. The premise of Chrysippus' argument is that the only kind of pleasure that exists is that which stimulates and moves the senses, permeating them with a feeling of delight. If that were true, neither the hand nor any other part of the body would be satisfied without a stimulation and movement of the senses. But, to the contrary, Epicurus holds that pleasure refers not only to active stimulation, but also that pleasure exists wherever the living thing is aware of feeling no pain. This means that while the man who answered Chrysippus's questions was correct to admit that his hand, which was not in pain, needed nothing more, he was not correct to admit that his hand in this condition felt a lack of pleasure. This is because a hand in its normal condition does not lack pleasure so long as it is without pain. For to be without pain is, in fact, a state of pleasure. As to the truth of the position that pleasure is the ultimate good, this can readily be seen from the following illustration. Let us imagine a man living in the continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures of both body and of mind, undisturbed either by the presence or by the prospect of pain. What possible state of existence could we describe as being better, more excellent, or more desirable? A man so situated must possess, in the first place, a strength of mind that is secure against all fear of death and of pain. Such a man will know that death means complete unconsciousness. He will also know that pain is generally light if long, and short if strong, so that intense pain is alleviated by its brief duration, and long-lasting pain has the compensation that it is generally less severe. Let such a man, moreover, have no dread of any supernatural power, and let him never suffer the pleasures of the past to fade away, but instead constantly renew his enjoyment of them in his memory. Such a man who has all these characteristics will be one whose condition cannot be made better or further improved. In contrast, consider a man who is crushed beneath the heaviest load of mental and of bodily anguish which a human can suffer. Give that person no hope of ultimate relief, and also give him no present pleasure, nor expectation of pleasure in the future. Can one describe or imagine a worse or more pitiable condition? If, then, a life full of pain is the thing most to be avoided, it follows that to live in pain is the highest evil. In turn, a life full of pleasure is the thing most to be desired, and to live in pleasure is the highest good. In truth, the mind possesses nothing in itself upon which it can rest as final. Every fear and every sorrow can be traced back to pain. There is no other thing besides pain which is of its own nature, capable of causing either anxiety or distress. Pleasure and pain, therefore, supply the motives of desire and of avoidance, and the springs of conduct generally. This being so, it clearly follows that actions are right and praiseworthy only to the extent they are a means to attain a life of pleasure. But that which is not itself a means to any other goal, but is itself a goal to which all else is a means, is what the Greeks term the telos, the highest, ultimate, or final good. It must therefore be admitted that the highest good in life is pleasure. Those who place the chief good in virtue alone are beguiled by the glamour of a name, and do not understand the true demands of nature. If they will only listen to Epicurus, they will be delivered from the grossest mistake. Your school, Cicero, loudly proclaims the transcendent beauty of the virtues. But were the virtues not productive of pleasure, who would deem them either praiseworthy or desirable? We esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. The art of navigation is commended for its practical and not for its scientific value, because it conveys the rules for sailing a ship with success. So, also wisdom, which must be considered to be the art of living, would not be desired if it produced no beneficial result. But as it is, wisdom is desired because it is the instrument that procures and produces pleasure. By now the meaning that I attach to the word pleasure must be clear to you, and you therefore should not be biased against my argument because of the discreditable associations others attach to the term. The great disturbing factor in a man's life is ignorance of what is good and evil. Mistaken ideas about these frequently rob us of our greatest pleasures and torment us with the most cruel pains of mind. Hence we need the aid of wisdom to rid us of our fears and appetites, to root out all our errors and prejudices, and to serve as our infallible guide to the attainment of pleasure. Wisdom alone is able to drive sadness from our minds, and to prevent us from quaking with fear. If we sit at wisdom's feet, we may live in perfect calm when once the heat of every passion has been cooled. The unbridled passions themselves have no conscience, and overthrow not merely individual men, but whole families, and often shake the foundations of the state. It is they that are the source of hatred, quarreling, and strife, of sedition, and of war. Nor do the passions only flaunt themselves and turn their blind onslaughts toward others. Even when held within the heart, they quarrel and fall out among themselves, and this cannot but render the whole of life embittered. For this reason, only the wise man, who prunes away all the rank growth of vanity and error, can possibly live untroubled by sorrow and by fear, content within the bounds that nature has set. In this regard, nothing could be more useful or more conducive to well-being than Epicurus's doctrine as to the different classes of the desires. One kind of desire Epicurus classified as both natural and necessary, a second as natural without being necessary, and a third as imaginary, as they are neither natural nor necessary. The principle of this classification is that necessary desires are gratified with little trouble or expense. The natural desires also require but little, since nature's own riches suffice to content her, and they are both easily procured and limited in amount. But, for the imaginary desires, on the other hand, no boundary or limit can be discovered. We therefore observe that ignorance and error reduce the whole of life to confusion, while wisdom alone is able to protect us from the onslaught of appetite and the menace of fear. Wisdom alone teaches us to bear the hardships of fortune and shows us the path that leads to calmness and to peace. Why then should we hesitate to declare that wisdom is to be desired, not for itself, but for the sake of the pleasures it brings, and folly is to be avoided, not because it is evil, but because of its injurious consequences? The same principle will lead us to pronounce that temperance also is not desirable for its own sake, but because it bestows peace of mind and soothes the heart with a sense of calm. It is temperance that warns us to be guided by reason in what we desire and avoid. Nor is it enough to judge in our minds what it is right to do or to leave undone. We also need to take action according to our judgment. Most men, however, lack tenacity of purpose. Their resolution weakens and fails as soon as the fair form of pleasure meets their gaze, and they surrender themselves prisoners to their passions, failing to foresee the inevitable result. Thus, for the sake of small and unnecessary pleasures, which they might obtain by other means, or even deny themselves altogether without pain, they incur serious disease, or loss of fortune, or disgrace. Not infrequently, they also become liable to suffer the penalties of the law and of the courts of justice. On the other hand, those men who are resolved to enjoy their pleasures so as to avoid painful consequences retain their judgment and avoid being seduced by pleasure into courses that they perceive to be wrong. These men reap the very highest pleasure by sometimes foregoing pleasure. Similarly, those who sometimes voluntarily endure pain avoid incurring greater pain by doing so. This clearly proves that temperance is not desirable because it renounces pleasure, but because it procures for us greater pleasures. The same account will be found to hold good of courage. The performance of labors and the undergoing of pains are not in themselves attractive, nor are endurance, industry, watchfulness, or that much lauded virtue, perseverance, nor even courage, attractive in themselves. We aim at these virtues in order to live without anxiety and fear, and so far as possible to be free from pain of mind and of body. The fear of death plays havoc with the calm and even tenor of life, and to bow the head to pain and bear it abjectly and feebly is a pitiable thing. Such weakness has caused many men to betray their parents or their friends, some to betray their country, and very many utterly to betray themselves to ruin. On the other hand, a strong and lofty spirit is entirely free from anxiety and sorrow, and makes light of death, for the dead are only as they were before they were born. A strong mind is schooled to encounter pain by remembering that pains of great severity are ended by death, and slight pains have frequent intervals of respite, while those pains of medium intensity lie within our own control. We can bear such pains if they are endurable, and if they are not endurable, we may serenely quit life's theater when the play has ceased to please us. These considerations prove that timidity and cowardice are not blamed, nor courage and endurance praised on their own account. The former are rejected because they bring pain, and the latter are coveted because they bring pleasure. It remains to speak of justice to complete the list of the virtues, but this admits of practically the same treatment as the others. I have already shown that wisdom, temperance, and courage are so closely linked with pleasure that they cannot possibly be separated from it. The same must be deemed to be the case with justice. Not only does justice never cause harm, but on the contrary, it always adds some benefit, partly owing to its essentially calming influence upon the mind, and partly because of the hope that it warrants of a never-failing supply of the things that uncorrupted nature really needs. And just as rashness, license, and cowardice torment the mind, ever awakening trouble and discord, so unrighteousness, when firmly rooted in the heart, causes restlessness by the mere fact of its presence. If injustice has once found expression in some deed of wickedness, however secret the act, the unjust man can never feel assured that he will always remain undetected. The usual consequences of crime are first suspicion, next gossip and rumor. Then comes the accuser, and then the judge. Many wrongdoers have even turned evidence against themselves, as happened when you, Cicero, were consul. Even if any unjust men think themselves well fortified against detection by their fellow men, such men still dread the eye of heaven, and fancy that the pangs of anxiety, night and day gnawing at their hearts, are sent by the gods to punish them. What can wickedness contribute towards lessening the annoyances of life, in light of its effect in increasing them, owing to the burden of a guilty conscience, the penalties of the law, and the hatred of one's fellow men? Nevertheless, some men indulge without limit their avarice, ambition, and love of power. For such men, ill-gotten gains can never diminish their lust, gluttony, and other desires, but rather inflames them so much that such men must be restrained rather than reformed. Men of sound natures, therefore, are summoned by the voice of true reason to justice, equity, and honesty. For those without eloquence or resources, dishonesty is not a good policy, since it is difficult for such men to succeed in their designs, or to retain their gains when once achieved. On the other hand, even for the rich and clever, generous conduct is more in keeping, because liberality wins them affection and goodwill, the surest means to a life of peace. Even more, there really is no motive for transgression, since the desires that spring from nature are easily gratified without doing any man wrong, while those desires that are imaginary can be resisted. Men given to imaginary desires set their affections upon nothing that is really needed. And there is more loss inherent in injustice itself than there is profit in the gains that injustice brings. Even justice itself cannot correctly be said to be desirable in and for itself. Justice is desirable because it is so highly productive of gratification. The esteem and affection held by the just are gratifying because these things render life safer and more full of pleasure. Hence, we hold that unrighteousness is to be avoided, not simply on account of the disadvantages that result from being unrighteous, but even more, because when it dwells in a man's heart, it never allows him to breathe freely or know a moment's rest. Therefore, in the final analysis, even justice, the glory of the virtues on which all the other philosophers love to proclaim so eloquently, has no meaning at all unless it be based on pleasure. In contrast, because pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically attractive and alluring, it cannot be doubted that pleasure is the one supreme and final good, and that a life of happiness is nothing else than a life of pleasure. The doctrine thus firmly established has corollaries which I will briefly explain. First, the ends of good and evil, that is, pleasure and pain, are not open to mistake. Where people go wrong is in not knowing what things are productive of pleasure and pain. Also, we hold that mental pleasures and pains arise out of bodily ones, and therefore I agree with you that any Epicureans who think otherwise put themselves out of court. I am aware that many do, though not those who can speak with authority. The truth is that although men experience both mental pleasures and pains, all of these, we assert, arise out of and are based upon bodily sensation. We Epicureans maintain that the fact all pleasures and pains are associated with the body does not prevent mental pleasures and pains from being much more intense than those of the body. That is because the body can feel only what is present to it at the moment, whereas the mind is also aware of the past and of the future. Even though bodily pains can be great, our sensation of pain is enormously increased if the mind believes that some evil of unlimited magnitude and duration threatens to befall us hereafter. And the same consideration applies to pleasure. A bodily pleasure is greater if not accompanied by any mental apprehension of evil. We therefore clearly conclude that intense mental pleasure or pain contributes more to our happiness or misery than a bodily pleasure or pain of equal duration. Further, we do not agree with the view that when pleasure is withdrawn, pain must follow at once, except in those circumstances where the pleasure is, in fact, specifically replaced by a pain. The truth is, we are glad to lose a pain, even though no active sensation of pleasure comes in its place, and this fact serves to show how the absence of pain is itself a pleasure. Just as we are elated by the anticipation of good things, so we are delighted by the memory of good things. Fools are tormented by the memory of former evils. Wise men have the delight of renewing in grateful remembrance the blessings of the past. This memory of past pleasures gives us the power both to obliterate our misfortunes in an almost perpetual forgetfulness, and also to summon up pleasant and agreeable memories of our successes. When we fix our mental vision closely on the events of the past, sorrow or gladness will follow according as to whether these events were evil or good. Here indeed is a royal road to happiness, open, simple, and direct. For clearly a man can have no greater good than complete freedom from pain and sorrow, coupled with the enjoyment of the highest bodily and mental pleasures. Notice then how the theory embraces every possible enhancement of life, every aid to the attainment of that chief good, pleasure, which is our object. Epicurus, the man whom you denounce as a hedonist, cries aloud that no one can live pleasantly without living wisely, honorably, and justly, and no one can live wisely, honorably, and justly without living pleasantly. A city rent by faction cannot prosper, nor a house whose masters are at strife. Much less then can a mind divided against itself, and filled with inward discord, taste any particle of pure and liberal pleasure. One who is perpetually torn by conflicting and incompatible ideas and desires can know no peace or calm. If the pleasures of life are diminished by the serious bodily diseases, how much more must they be diminished by the diseases of the mind? Extravagant and imaginary desires for riches, fame, and power, and also desire for licentious pleasures, are nothing but mental diseases. Then, too, there are grief, trouble, and sorrow, which gnaw at the heart and consume it with anxiety, if men fail to realize that the mind need feel no pain apart from some pain of body, now or to come. Yet there is no foolish man but is afflicted by one or more of these diseases. Therefore all foolish men are unhappy. Moreover, there is death, the stone of Tantalus ever hanging over men's heads, and religious superstition that poisons and destroys all peace of mind. Such men do not remember their past or enjoy their present blessings. They merely look forward to those of the future, and as these are of necessity uncertain, they are consumed with agony and terror. The climax of the torment these men face is when they perceive, too late, that all their dreams of wealth or station, power or fame have come to nothing. For such men never attain any of the pleasures for which they hoped, and which inspired them to undergo all their laborious toils. Look also at those men who are petty, narrow-minded, confirmed pessimists, spiteful, envious, ill-tempered, unsociable, abusive, and brutal. Consider also those who are enslaved to the follies of love, impudent, reckless, wanton, headstrong, and yet irresolute, always changing their minds. Such failings render the lives of such men one unbroken round of misery. Therefore no foolish man can be happy, nor can any wise man fail to be happy. This is a truth that we establish far more conclusively than do the Stoics, for they maintain that nothing is good save that vague phantom which they entitle moral worth, a title that is more splendid than substantial. At the same time, the Stoics say that virtue resting on this moral worth has no need of pleasure, but is all that is needed for happiness. At the same time, this Stoic doctrine can be stated in a form to which we would not object, and indeed we ourselves endorse. For Epicurus explains how the wise man is always happy in this way. The wise man keeps his desires within bounds. He disregards death. He has a true conception of the divine nature, untainted by fear. And he does not hesitate to depart from life, if that would better his condition. Thus equipped, the wise man enjoys perpetual pleasure, for there is no moment when the pleasures he experiences do not outbalance his pain. The wise man remembers the past with gratitude, grasps the present with a full realization of its pleasantness, and does not rely upon the future. The wise man looks forward to the future, but finds his true enjoyment in the present. The wise man is also entirely free from the vices that I have described, and he derives considerable pleasure from comparing his own wise existence with the life of the foolish. Moreover, any pains that the wise man may encounter are never so severe, but that he has more cause for gladness than for sorrow. It is a fine saying of Epicurus that the wise man is but little interfered with by fortune. The great concerns of life, the things that matter, are controlled by his own reason and wisdom. Epicurus also said that no greater pleasure could be derived from a life of infinite duration than is actually afforded by this existence, which we know to be finite. Propositional logic, on which your school lays such stress, Epicurus held to be of no effect, either as a guide to practical conduct or as an aid to thought. Natural philosophy, on the other hand, Epicurus deemed all important. Natural philosophy explains to us the meaning of terms, the nature of logical reasoning, and the laws of consistency and contradiction. Secondly, a thorough knowledge of the facts of nature relieves us of the burden of superstition, frees us from fear of death, and shields us against the disturbing effects of ignorance, which is often in itself a cause of terrifying apprehensions. Lastly, to learn nature's true requirements improves the moral character. It is only by firmly grasping a well-established scientific system and observing the canon of truth, the rule that has all but fallen from heaven, so that all men may know it, and making that canon the test of all our judgments, that we can hope to stand firm in our beliefs, unshaken by the objections of others. On the other hand, without a full understanding of the world of nature, it is impossible to maintain the truth of our sense perceptions. Every mental conception has its origin in sensation, and no certain knowledge is possible unless all sensations are judged to be truthful, as the theory of Epicurus teaches that they are. Those who deny the validity of sensation and say that nothing can be perceived, having excluded the evidence of the senses, are unable even to maintain their own argument. By abolishing knowledge and science, such men abolish all possibility of rational life and action. Thus, natural philosophy supplies courage to face the fear of death, and resolution to resist the terrors of religion. Natural philosophy supplies peace of mind, for it removes all ignorance of the mysteries of nature. And it supplies self-control, for it explains the nature of the desires and distinguishes their different kinds. Further, the canon, or criterion of knowledge, which Epicurus established, gives us a method of discerning what is true from what is false. There remains a topic that is preeminently germane to this discussion, and that is the subject of friendship. Your school maintains that if pleasure is held to be the chief good, friendship will cease to exist. To the contrary, Epicurus pronounces that of all the means to happiness that wisdom has devised, none is greater, none more fruitful, and none more delightful than friendship. Nor did Epicurus only commend this doctrine by his words, but far more, he endorsed it with the example of his own life and conduct. How great a thing is friendship is shown by the mythical stories of antiquity. Review the legends from the remotest ages, and extensive and varied as they are, you will barely find in them 3 pairs of friends, beginning with Theseus and ending with Orestes. Yet Epicurus in a single house, and a small one at that, maintained a whole company of friends, united by the closest sympathy and affection. And this still goes on today in the Epicurean school. But to return to our subject, for there is no need of further personal examples, I am aware that the topic of friendship has been treated by Epicureans in 3 ways. First, some have denied that pleasures affecting our friends are in themselves to be desired by us in the same degree as we desire our own pleasures. This doctrine is argued by some critics to undermine the foundations of friendship. However, its supporters defend their position, and in my opinion they have no difficulty in making good their side of the argument. They argue that friendship can no more be separated from pleasure than can the virtues, which we have discussed already. A solitary, friendless life must be beset by secret dangers and alarms. Hence, reason itself advises that we acquire friends, for their possession gives confidence, and a firmly rooted hope of winning pleasure. And just as hatred, jealousy, and contempt are hindrances to pleasure, so friendship is the most trustworthy preserver and also creator of pleasure, both for our friends and for ourselves. Friendship affords us enjoyment in the present, and it inspires us with hope for the near and distant future. Thus, it is not possible to secure uninterrupted pleasure in life without friendship, nor yet to preserve friendship itself, unless we love our friends as much as ourselves. Hence, this unselfishness exists in friendship, while also friendship is closely linked with our own pleasure. For we rejoice in our friends' joy as much as in our own, and we are equally pained by their sorrows. Therefore, the wise man will feel exactly the same towards his friends as he does towards himself, and he will exert himself as much for his friend's pleasure as he would for his own. All that has been said about the essential connection of the virtues with pleasure must be repeated about friendship. Epicurus well said, and I give almost his exact words. The same creed that has given us courage to overcome all fear of everlasting or long-enduring evil in the future has discerned that friendship is our strongest safeguard in this present term of life. Other Epicureans, though by no means lacking in insight, are less courageous in defying the contemptuous criticisms of the Academy. These men fear that if we hold friendship to be desirable only for the pleasure that it affords to ourselves, it will be thought that friendship is crippled altogether. To these men, the first advances and overtures, and the original inclination to form an attachment, are prompted by the desire for pleasure. They then say, however, that when the progress of friendship leads to intimacy, the relationship blossoms into an affection, strong enough to make us love our friends for their own sake, even though no practical advantage accrues to us from their friendship. Is it not true that familiarity endears us to localities, temples, cities, gymnasia, playgrounds, horses, dogs, gladiatorial shows, and fights with wild beasts? Then how much more natural and reasonable is it that familiarity should lead to pleasure in our dealings with our friends? The third view is that wise men have made a sort of compact to love their friends no less than themselves. We can understand the possibility of this, and we often see it happen. Clearly, no more effective means to happiness could be found than such an alliance. All these considerations go to prove not only that the theory of friendship is not undermined by the identification of the chief good with pleasure, but also that without these considerations no foundation for friendship whatsoever can be found. If then the doctrine I have set forth is more clear and more luminous than daylight itself, if it is derived entirely from nature's source, if my whole explanation relies throughout for confirmation on the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses, if lisping infants and even dumb animals, prompted by nature's teaching, can almost find voice to proclaim that there is no welfare but pleasure, no hardship but pain, and their judgment in these matters is neither perverted or biased, ought we not feel the greatest gratitude to Epicurus, who caught this utterance of nature's voice, and grasped its meaning so firmly and so fully that he has guided all sane-minded men into the path of peace and happiness, calmness and repose? You smugly allege that Epicurus was uneducated because he refused to consider any education worthy of the name, if it did not educate us in happiness. Was Epicurus to spend his time, as you encourage Triarius and me to do, in perusing the poets, who give us nothing solid and useful, but merely childish amusement? Was Epicurus to occupy himself, like Plato, with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, which, when starting from false premises, cannot be true, and which, moreover, if they were true, would contribute nothing to make our lives better or more pleasant? Was Epicurus, I say, to study arts like these, and neglect the master art, so difficult and correspondingly so fruitful, the art of living? No, it was not Epicurus who was uneducated. The truly unwise are those who ask us to go on studying until old age the subjects that we ought to be ashamed that we did not learn when we were children. With these words, Torquatus completed his defense of Epicurus. The preceding text has been adapted into modern American English based on the translations of Harris Rackham, James Reed, and Charles Young. On October 26, 2025, this version of the presentation was issued into the public domain. We thank all participants at EpicureanFriends.com who made this presentation possible.